Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Mistreating Widows and Orphans. Whom does this law address? With Rabbi Dr. Martin Lockshin. And I want to thank our great partners at BMHBJ for co-sponsoring today's event, and would love to pass it over to Rabbi Chitovsky to introduce today's guest speaker.
Thank you very much, everyone. Rabbi Dr. Martin Lockshin is University Professor Emeritus at York University in Toronto, I believe. Now lives in Jerusalem. Received a Ph.D. in Near Eastern Judaic Studies from Brandeis University and rabbinic ordination while studying in Israel, while studying in Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav Kook. I was provided a very modest bio. You can look up Rabbi Lockshin's name, and you can see a plethora of recognition and involvement in communities, both academic and general. And he specializes in the translation, a 4-volume translation and annotation of the commentary of the Rashbam on the Torah. And the Rashbam's commentary fits right into Rabbi Lockshin's Weltanschauung, worldview, very traditional, very innovative, and in a way anticipating much of what academic Bible is all about today, but all within the context of a well-respected grandson of Rashi, the Rashbam, and you can find that on your own. And today we're going to be discussing a very interesting question: who is the audience for many of the Torah's prohibitions and prescriptions that do not indicate an audience? So who exactly is the Torah talking to? And without any further ado, Rabbi Dr. Martin Lockshin.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction. And in fact, you hit to a T whenever I'm asked why I'm interested in Rashbam. You just said it in like 2 sentences, what attracts me to the worldview of Rashbam, and I hope that I follow a little bit in his footsteps. I try. The issue that I'm going to be talking about today has some relationship to an issue that we discuss in our society today. When it comes to the disadvantage of society, who's ultimately responsible for taking care of the disadvantaged people in our society? Is it, do we say the government takes care of them, or do we say that each one of us has a responsibility to take care of the disadvantaged people in society? I'm not going to, in the text that we're going to be looking at, I'm not going to be directly dealing with that, but the text that we're going to look at from our tradition can, I think, teach us something about this big question of what it is that, who it is who should be taking care of the disadvantaged people in our society. So I'm going to share a screen with you so that we can begin to look at some text. I'm going to read the text in English as we go through the text. For those of you who can handle the Hebrew, you have it there on the left. Occasionally, I'll make reference to something in the Hebrew, but we'll try to do this with the English translations here. There are many laws in the Torah that talk about the disadvantaged people in society. In Exodus chapter 22 and 23, Parshat Mishpatim, also called by critical scholars called the Covenant Code, you shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. And there are many more verses of this nature in the Bible. And the question is, as the rabbi just put it a few minutes ago, who's being addressed in these verses? Well, begin with a quotation from a relatively new book written by Dr. Jeremiah or Jerry Unterman, a book called Justice for All: How the Jewish Bible Revolutionized Ethics. The book's goal is to demonstrate by substantial evidence derived from various sources, Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian, Hittite, Ugaritic, Assyrian, and of course biblical, that the Jewish Bible not only changed the course of ethical thought, but advanced it far beyond ancient Near Eastern society and religion in key areas. In other words, Jerry Unterman is arguing that what the kind of verses that we saw about worrying about the disadvantaged people in society, the strangers, the widows, and the orphans, is the contribution of Judaism to the ethics of the world. I wrote a review of this book. You can look it up sometime if you want to see that. I'm actually quite impressed with the work that Unterman put into this book. And you'll pardon me for quoting from my book review. Unterman reports a conversation that he had with a scholar who wrote that Sumerian and Babylonian law codes protected strangers to the same extent that the Bible protected strangers, a conclusion that Unterman feels is entirely unsupported by evidence. When Unterman asked him how he could come to such a conclusion, the scholar answered that when he wrote that book, he was rebelling against the strict Christian upbringing that he had received in his parents' home, and was thus looking to prove that the Bible was nothing special. So really the question is the Bible something special? Is the Bible saying something different about strangers, widows, and orphans, about disadvantaged people in society, something that was not being said commonly throughout the ancient world? Well, I'll put my cards on the table here. I agree with Unterman. I believe that the Bible is different. I believe that the Bible has a different kind of message than the literature that was being produced 3,000 years ago, and even more recently than that. However, you see here the cover of a book that came out in 2006 called The Contemporary Torah, published by the Jewish Publication Society. It's a really interesting book. It's an attempt to translate the Torah into language that is more gender sensitive than the language that we normally find in English translations of the Torah. Some of the contemporary Torah was just modernized. A new version came out in late 2023. A new version of this came out for the entire Tanakh, for the entire Bible, not just for the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So here's a picture of the new volume that just came out. I have a copy on its way to me soon. I haven't actually seen it, but it is available online. You can find this new translation online, the JPS Tanakh, a gender-sensitive edition. This project was done in partnership with Sefaria. For those of you who aren't acquainted with Sefaria, Sefaria is a fantastic website where you can find amazing sources of Jewish knowledge. And when you open up, if you like, you open up Exodus chapter 22 like this, you see right away, and you want the English of Exodus chapter 22, you get the Contemporary Torah JPS 2006. You see that at the top of the slide there. That's their default translation of the Torah. They give you the opportunity to change if you don't like that translation. It's a great resource. You've got about a dozen different Jewish English translations of the Torah, but this is the default one that you get if you don't go shopping for a translation. Okay, and just so you see a little something about what was done in this book. Here's an example of a difference between the old Jewish Publication Society translation, which actually people call the new Jewish Publication Society translation. There was a translation back in 1917, but in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Jewish Publication Society came out with a new translation of the Tanakh. And if you look at this verse in Exodus chapter 22, take this for an example. If you take your neighbor's garment and pledge, you must return it to him before the sun sets. It is his only clothing, the sole covering for his skin. In what else shall he sleep? Therefore, if he cries out to me, I will pay heed, for I am compassionate. You see here, the Hebrew also says, Tishivenu lo, return it to him. Does this law apply also if you've taken your female neighbor's garment in pledge? Of course it does. No one would think for a minute that it doesn't. But as we know, people in antiquity and until a couple of decades ago, when they wanted to say a man or a woman, they put it in masculine, and that was considered the normal way of speaking. However, the contemporary Torah attempts to write this in gender-sensitive language and remove, whenever possible, the masculine pronouns from the text. So you look at it, you see, it's the goal here is an excellent goal, but the question is whether the contemporary Torah has actually succeeded in creating a translation that the elegant English. Everybody can judge here. If you take your neighbor's garment and pledge, you must return it before the sun sets instead of return it to him. Okay, fine. If you say return it, then we understand that it's to the person to whom it belongs. It is the only available clothing. It is what covers the skin. In what else shall your neighbor sleep? Therefore, if that person cries out to me, I will pay heed, for I am compassionate. So here's an example, to my mind, of something a little bit clumsy, but you can say that it's worthwhile to have a little bit of clumsiness in your translation if it is going to remove the sexism of having the text be totally masculine. Okay. And here's an example of something that's done, I think, more elegantly in that book. So, the old Jewish Publication Society from 1985 says, for this verse in Deuteronomy, the rock, about God, the rock, his deeds are perfect, yea, all his ways are just, a faithful God, never false, true and upright is he. The contemporary Torah tries as much as possible not to use masculine pronouns about God, arguing quite reasonably that God is above masculinity or femininity that has nothing to do with God. So why would one use masculine pronouns about God? So I thought that this was done actually kind of elegantly. The rock, whose deeds are perfect, yea, all God's ways are just, a faithful God, never false, true and upright indeed. I think it works. So in general, I think that the contemporary Torah sometimes does a smart and elegant job of translating the Bible into language that is gender sensitive, and sometimes doesn't do that job as elegantly as I wish that it did. I have a lot to say about that, but that's all just introduction to the fact that the contemporary Torah just decided that it was going to throw in things that had nothing to do with gender also into the translation. And they did it right here on the verse that we started with about not mistreating a widow or an orphan. What else does the contemporary Torah do? Well, here's what it does. In the JPS translation, the Jewish Publication Society from 1985, the translation reads, "You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan." And the contemporary Torah in 2006 reads, "You, communal leaders, shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan." The Hebrew just reads, "Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun." Where did they get this communal leaders? Well, there's a little asterisk there, which sends you to a footnote. We'll see that in a second. Around 50 times in Exodus 21, 22, and 23, the Torah turns to you, and it's talking to you. I just gave you a few of them, the examples here. You shall not tolerate a sorceress. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. If you lend money to my people, if you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you shall not revile God. You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the male firstborn among your children. You shall be holy people to me. You, doesn't say that you in this verse in the English translation, but the Hebrew is obviously second person, tirchak. You keep far away from davar sheker, which might mean a false charge. It might mean a falsehood. You can't tell. There are many verses where you, like this last one here, where you can't tell who is the audience. Is this talking to judges and saying you should be, because some of the laws in Exodus 21, 22, and 23 are actually talking to judges. And this might be saying, be careful about false witnesses who might be testifying in your courts. Or it might be talking to all of us that we should try to stay away from falsehood, that we should try to tell the truth. So those are many of the yous in Exodus 21, 22, and 23 are undefined and can be argued about. And shockingly, the contemporary Torah decides to tell you who the you is a grand total of one time in Exodus 21, 22, and 23. Only this one, they say, this is talking to the communal leaders. Now, here's the full footnote that you can find in the contemporary Torah. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. You communal leaders shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. Footnote reads, in ancient Israel and the Near East, the responsibility for assisting and protecting widows and the fatherless was understood to rest upon local householders, elders, priests, and the king, listed here as communal leaders in the translation. See, for example, Zechariah 7, Ezekiel 22, Isaiah 1, Jeremiah 22. So the contemporary Torah is making two arguments here. First of all, the Bible is the same as the ancient Near East in its attitude towards widows and orphans. You remember at the beginning of this session, I showed you Jerry Unterman's claim that the Bible is a revolutionary document when it comes to the treatment of widows and orphans and other disadvantaged people within society. The contemporary Torah argues, well, it's actually the same in ancient Israel and in the Near East, and in both of these places, it was felt that the communal leaders were responsible for taking care of the disadvantaged people in society. So here's one of the proofs that's adduced by the contemporary Torah to prove that the Bible thinks the communal leaders are the ones who are responsible for taking care of disadvantaged people. The prophet Zechariah writes, the word of the Lord to Zechariah continued, thus says the Lord of hosts, execute true justice. Okay, mishpat emet shvotu, execute true justice. That's true. That's directed towards the judges. But what about the next phrase? Deal loyally and compassionately with one another. Is this directed to judges? Is this directed to communal leaders? I think the line that says, deal loyally and compassionately with one another is pretty clearly directed to all of us. Do not defraud the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor, and do not plot evil against one another. Is that directed to communal leaders? Don't plot evil against one another? Or is it directed to all of us? The proof that the contemporary Torah tries to bring that this is the responsibility of the communal leaders, it just isn't proof. Here's another one of their proofs from Ezekiel chapter 22. So Ezekiel is very angry at the Jewish community in the land of Israel in his day, as you shall see from this quotation here, and he accuses them of some terrible things. And the beginning of the text is actually talking about the communal leaders. Every one of the princes of Israel in your midst used his strength for the shedding of blood. That's a very strong accusation, and it's accusation against the communal leaders. But as the text goes on, it's not talking about communal leaders. Fathers and mothers have been humiliated within you. Is that talking about communal leaders failing to respect one's parents? Strangers have been cheated in your midst. Orphans and widows have been wronged within you. You have despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths. In you they have, in you, meaning in Jerusalem, they have uncovered their father's nakedness. In you they have ravished women during their impurity. They have committed abhorrent acts with other men's wives. In their depravity they have defiled their own daughters-in-law. In you they have ravished their own sisters. Is this an accusation of communal leaders? Well, it's an accusation of everybody, including the communal leaders. So this proof that the contemporary Torah is trying to bring that actually this law was directed at communal leaders just has no basis to it. And when I showed this to my friend Jerry Unterman, who I mentioned before, about the author of the book about how the Bible revolutionized ethics, I asked him, Jerry, what do you think of this? And I asked him, may I quote you? Here's his email back to me, and he gave me permission to quote him. As I wrote in the book, I agree with Rashi that Exodus 21:1 and following is addressed to the entire people. Further, there's not a single law or legal document in the entire ancient Near East which speaks to the benefit of the poor widow or the poor orphan. So that footnote is inaccurate in every way I can think of. The translation is not a translation. It's a poor commentary. It's a mistaken commentary, and it's in fact, to my mind, it's shocking that the Jewish Publication Society came out with a translation like this that has an axe to grind and a mistaken axe to grind. So that, there were two parts of the claim of the contemporary Torah about this. Part one was that the Torah is really directing its instruction here to communal leaders. And the other part is that it's very similar to what's going on in the ancient Near East. And Jerry Unterman says, no, it's very different from what's going on in the ancient Near East. Are there parallels in the ancient Near East? And I'll honestly tell you that my Akkadian, my knowledge of the languages of the law codes that were written before the Torah in the ancient Near East, like the law code of Hammurabi. I'm not one of the world's experts on these law codes, but I consulted with some of the world's experts on the law codes of the ancient Near East from the time of the Torah and from before the time of the Torah. And you have to really scrape to find any reference in any of these law codes to widows and orphans. And they appear through the Torah and through the Bible frequently, but they do not appear in the law codes of the ancient Near East, except here's a couple of little examples. From the law code of Hammurabi, written 600 years, 700 years before the days of Moses, perhaps the most famous law code of the ancient Near East. So here's the one and only reference to widows in the law code of Hammurabi. If a widow whose children are minors sets her face to enter another house, in other words, she wants to marry somebody else, she cannot do so without the consent of the judges. They're worried that she's going to walk off with the property of the first husband and give it to the second husband and take it away from the children. And so the law is getting involved to protect the children so that the widow doesn't walk off with the property. When she enters another house, the judge shall inquire into the estate of her former husband, and they shall entrust the estate of the former husband to the later husband and that woman, and they shall deliver to them a tablet to sign. And so the new husband is getting some control over the property of the dead husband. They shall administer the estate and rear the minors. So the new husband has to take responsibility for the children. They may not sell the household goods. He who purchases household goods belonging to the sons of a widow shall forfeit his money. You can't buy something from a widow because she doesn't own it. It goes to her children. The goods shall revert to the owner. So this is what Hammurabi has to say about widows and orphans. Hammurabi deals with widows and orphans only in order to deal with the question, which sadly occurred throughout history and sometimes occurs even in our day, that when somebody dies, the spouse and the children end up arguing about the estate. So that's all that Hammurabi has to say about widows and orphans. There's another law code from the ancient Near East. If a woman whose husband is dead does not leave her house after the death of her husband, if her husband did not deed her anything in writing, she shall reside in the house of one of her sons wherever she chooses. What happens if she's penniless and all the money went to the children? Then the children are responsibility for taking care of their widowed mother. Here's one example, the one example that you can find in law codes from the ancient Near East, a law code worrying that the widow should not be mistreated, but she should not be mistreated by her own children. Her husband's sons shall provide for her. But the idea of saying, as the contemporary Torah wished to argue, that the same thing is going on in the Bible as in the ancient Near East is totally baseless. And to review what Unterman said, he said, there isn't a single law or legal document in the entire ancient Near East which speaks to the benefit of the poor widow or the poor orphan. There are some laws in the ancient Near East that talk about intra-family fights between children and between the orphans and the widow, but nothing about the society or the individuals of the society having any responsibility of taking care of poor widows or poor orphans. On the other hand, the Bible is filled with this, not just the verse that we saw to kick off the session today, but not mistreating widows and orphans. It's throughout the Bible. The prophet Malachi writes, I will act as a relentless accuser against those who have no fear of me, of God speaking here, who practice sorcery, who commit adultery, who swear falsely, who cheat laborers of their hire, and who subvert the cause of the widow, orphan, and the stranger, said the Lord of hosts. God promises to punish those who subvert the cause of the widow and the orphan and the stranger. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, when you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. That there are dozens of verses like this. I'm not giving them all to you, but just give you a certain taste of how law codes. The first one here, admittedly, at the top of the screen is a prophet just giving exhortation to people, but the bottom, it's a law. The law is that you have to allow the orphan and the widow to come and take part of your harvest. Some more verses about widows. Then the Levite who has no hereditary portion as you have, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow in your settlements shall come, and they shall eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you. This is not talking about taking care of the widow who's in your family, your widowed mother or something of that nature. It is talking about the community worrying about the widows that are in their society. Another verse, Deuteronomy 26, when you've set aside in full the 10th part of your yield in the 3rd year, the year of the tithe, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat their fill in your settlements. Again, a law legislating that we have to. The Torah isn't saying that it's just, it's an act of charity, of grace, or something like this to take care of the widow and the orphan. It's a law. It's like any other law in the Torah. In the book of Job, Job's so-called friend Eliphaz speaks to him and said, I know that your wickedness is great. Everybody here, I'm sure, remembers the basic plot of the book of Job. Job is suffering. The text tells us that he's suffering even though he does not deserve to be suffering. And his friends tried to convince him that obviously, if he's suffering, he deserves to be suffering because God would not mistreat him like that. So Job's friend Eliphaz says to him in Job chapter 22, you know that your wickedness is great. You do not give the thirsty water to drink. You deny bread to the hungry. The land belongs to the strong. The privileged occupy it. You have sent away widows empty-handed. The strength of the orphans is broken. Therefore, snares are all around you, and sudden terrors frighten you. You, Job, you were among the privileged in society, and you did not take care of the widows and orphans, and that's why you're suffering. And Job answers in chapter 29. He says, I saved the poor man who cried out, the orphan who had none to help him. And here, getting back to the contemporary Torah, the revised JPS translation, here is, who had no helper. It's very nice. There's no need to have that masculine pronoun there to help him. The orphan who had no helper. I received the blessing of the lost. I gladdened the heart of the widow. So there's this clear understanding that a way of telling the righteousness of a person is by looking to see. Job's friend Eliphaz says, you must be suffering because you didn't take care of the of widows and orphans. And Job says, well, actually, I did. I gladdened the heart of the widow. And that's why Job is so upset in the book of Job. So let's get back to our verses in Exodus 22. For those of you who can handle the Hebrew on the left-hand side, you see in the Hebrew that I highlighted in red two different verbs here. The first verb is te'anun, and the second verb is te'aneh. And the problem that we have in English is that, at least in modern English and contemporary English, we do not make a distinction between you singular and you plural. When you're talking to somebody, if you're in a room with more than one person and you say, when did you get here? Nobody knows, are you talking to one person or are you talking to all the people who are there in the room? And in Hebrew, you can tell the difference whether you're talking in the singular or in the plural. And in Old English, you could tell the difference. And KJV on the right-hand side means the King James Version, the Old King James Bible. There you can tell the difference between a plural and a singular. So the first verse here is translated in the King James Version as, ye shall not afflict any widow or orphan. Ye, meaning you, plural. And then it shifts to you singular. The King James Version says, if thou afflict them, that's how you say you singular in Old English. If you singular do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children shall become orphans. Very strong punishment being proposed here by the text, but the shift here between you plural and you singular caught the attention of many of the traditional Jewish commentators on the Bible. You plural versus you singular, te'anun versus te'aneh. In the 13th century, commentary who's known by the name Chizkuni, Rabbi Chizkiah ben Manoach, who lived in the south of France, wrote, this mitzvah alone of all the laws here is written in plural. Pardon the extra word there. Alone of all the laws here is written in plural, for everyone can be considered to have sinned in this way, even those who did not themselves belittle the widows and orphans, but simply saw this being done and remained quiet without protesting. Very strong ethical message here by Rabbi Chizkiah ben Manoach that it's not enough to be someone who refrains from mistreating widows and orphans. If you live in a society and you see that widows and orphans are being mistreated and you keep your mouth shut, then you too are guilty. And that, he argues, is the meaning of the shift here from you plural to you singular. Abraham Ibn Ezra, on the plural form followed by the singular, writes here, you plural shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, if one person afflicts an orphan or a widow, and no one comes to their aid, everyone is punished, is Abraham Ibn Ezra's message here. Shadal, Samuel David Luzzatto in 19th century Italy says the following about why we have a plural form here. The Hebrew is in the plural. And as we saw, this is the only place in chapter 21, 22, 23, or 24 that the plural is used. The Hebrew is in the plural. The command is to the entire nation. That is, to the judges who will decide their cases. They are not to allow any individual to mistreat a widow or orphan without being punished. So Shadal essentially does say that there is, of course, a special responsibility of the community leaders. The community leaders have the responsibility of setting up a community where no one is taking advantage of the widows or the orphans. It's not that all the responsibility falls on the communal leaders, but the communal leaders have the job of making sure that the community is set up in such a way that the rights of widows and orphans are protected. Therefore, the penalty falls on the nation at large. I will slay you, etchem, plural, with the sword. The text, again, going back to the text here, the biblical text, it begins in the plural. You, plural, shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. And then it goes to the singular, if you do mistreat them. And then we have also in the third verse here, my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the, you plural to the, so it's going back and forth. It starts with plural, then it goes to singular, and then it goes back to plural. And Shadal says that this is to teach that the penalty falls on the nation at large. So this is quite a level of responsibility that we have, that if we're living in a community and we're allowing our community to mistreat the weak people in society, then there's a terrible punishment that the Torah promises to this community. Well, let's just look for a second, go step back for a second. Let's look at the stranger, which is the mate of the widows and the orphans. We saw that the verses in Exodus are talking about the weak people in society, the strangers, the widows, and the orphans. Many lines about mistreating the stranger in the Bible. Here are two of them in Exodus chapter 22 and 23. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Or you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourself been strangers in the land of Egypt. Commentators on the Torah struggle to explain what the precise logic is of this connection. Why does it say that you shouldn't oppress a stranger? I was born in Toronto, so does that mean that I have to always be nice to everybody from Toronto? I should be nice to everybody, but just, the fact that I came from Toronto doesn't necessarily mean that there's something special about the people in Toronto. What is the logic here? One of the great Bible commentators from from Spain who moved to Israel late in life was Ramban, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman. In the 13th century, he wrote in his Bible commentary, "There's no reason why all strangers should be considered kosher just because of our having been strangers in the land of Egypt." You know, what's the logic here? I don't get it. Why should I be nice to a stranger just because I was a stranger in the land of Egypt? Or that they should feel assured for that reason forever against being wronged or oppressed. Well, why should strangers assume that just because we were once strangers, what's the logic here? So here's what Ramban says. I think just maybe to save time here, I'm going to skip here. He's saying, here's what Rashi said, here's what Ibn Ezra said, but none of this makes sense. That's what he says at the end of the slide. And then he tells you what he thinks about the subject. In my opinion, the correct interpretation is, do not wrong strangers or oppress them, thinking, as you might, that no one can save them from your hand, for you know that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and I saw the oppression that the Egyptians oppressed you, and I took vengeance on them on your behalf. So the line of the verse, you shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. When you think about the fact that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, you should remember what happened when you were a stranger in the land of Egypt, and when you were mistreated when you lived in the land of Egypt. You know what happened. For I see, God speaking here, I see the tears of those who are oppressed by the powerful and have no comforter, and I deliver them from people who are stronger than they are. Likewise, you shall not afflict the widow and the orphan, for I will hear their cry. For all these people do not rely upon themselves, but they trust in me. That's what the Torah is saying when it says you shouldn't mistreat a stranger because you remember what happened when you were mistreated as strangers in the land of Egypt. And many years ago, a little more than 50 years ago, I had the great privilege of studying Torah with the greatest Torah teacher of the 20th century, Nechama Leibovitz. And I remember she asked us, all the students in her class, she said, what punctuation does Ramban think should be put into this verse here? And I remember we all looked at her and we had no idea what she was talking about. And none of us could figure out what it is that she wanted. What punctuation did she think that Ramban put into this verse? So if you feel bad, I never understood. I didn't. I couldn't figure out the answer either. But then she explained to us how Ramban read this verse. He read it with an ellipsis at the end, with 3 dots at the end. You shouldn't wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. ... And you know what happened when you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so the message of the Torah is on these issues that we should remember what happened to strangers in the it happened to the people who oppressed us as strangers when we were in the land of Egypt, and all of us have the responsibility of making sure that we not do that today. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I see there's some questions in the chat, and if people want, Rabbi Unterman he spoke last week.
He did, yeah. And he mentioned
Did he talk about this?
Not this, but he mentioned that you were a good friend of his, and that presentation was about the Book of Prophets. But thank you so much. This was a great presentation, and yeah, we'd love to open it up to questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hands, and we can call on people to unmute. And we can also take a look at the chat as well.
Should widowers be equivalent included and treated similarly to widows? Harold asked. Naturally, they should. I think there was a particular concern in ancient society that that a woman who did not have a man to protect her was in bad shape in ancient societies. But you're right. If we're trying to have a gender sensitive attitude today, then anyone who's left alone after the death of a spouse is someone who needs our support. There's no question about that. Any other questions people would like to ask? Please, Rabbi.
Thank you. Something just struck me in the confines of, Jewish community, when it's only Jews. There was a rabbinic discussion about what the word l'reacha meant in v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And the question was maybe academic, I don't know, but let's say you're living in a not exclusively Jewish environment. Who is re'acha? Is there been any similar conversation rabbinically as to not so much who the you is, but who are the widows, orphans, and downtrodden that need to be educated? Is there any parsing of that you know of? I hope the answer is no, but I'm just wondering.
Well, I think it's a great question. And so I assume that if the stranger is there, the stranger, the simple pshat, the simple contextual explanation of what the stranger there in the text is that it's somebody who isn't a Jew and isn't an Israelite and who's living in our society, and because of that, the person, the Torah is imagining a Jewish polity, imagining a Jewish majority community. And what happens if there's somebody who's a stranger who isn't part of the community, and says you can't mistreat them, and it also says you can't mistreat widows and orphans. So presumably you also can't mistreat widows and orphans who are strangers who are living in your community. I think it's just a logical read of the text. Since you asked the question, though, I'll just mention that another thing that irritated me about this contemporary Torah is that on that verse that you just quoted, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, which the old JPS translation translates as love your fellow as yourself, which leaves it kind of open. The fellow could be a fellow Israelite, or it could just be anybody out there. The contemporary Torah decided to add in the word Israelite there. They wrote, love your fellow Israelite as yourself. And I found that extremely irritating too. I think that there was a general agenda of the contemporary Torah to try to make the Torah not sound as progressive, which seems to be going against the whole purpose of trying to make the text be more gender sensitive, and so it'll speak more clearly to people now in the 21st century. So why in the world was it also taking stances like this that made the Torah sound less progressive?
I think there might have been a translation of reacha in another context that was translated as kin.
Right.
Means like your family.
Right.
So it's probably going to be your family, your fellow Israelite family, and
yes.
maybe they're just. But it doesn't resonate well in an otherwise progressive idea of having a gender sensitive. They should just have a truth sensitive and an ethical sensitive.
Ethical sensitive, yes. Again, to quote my teacher, Nechama Leibovich, she used to argue that obviously the word reacha has to mean both an Israelite and a non-Israelite, because it says in the beginning of the book of Exodus, when the Jews are still slaves in the land of Egypt, V'shala isha ish me'et re'ehu v'isha me'et re'uta klei chesef u'klei zahav u'smalot. That you are to borrow or to ask for vessels of silver and gold from your re'ah. And obviously there it's talking about Egyptians. And so it's not a fellow Israelite. So I would say, I mentioned that there's a redo of the of this version from 2006 that just came out at the end of 2023. And while it still says there, love your fellow Israelite as yourself, on Genesis 19:18, they added a footnote. And the footnote said that at the end of the chapter, there is a verse that says, it sends you to the end of the chapter where there is a verse about the ger, the stranger, in which it says, Va'ahavta lo kamocha. And so maybe it's possible that Re'ah means a fellow Israelite, but at least they were admitting that there's another verse coming up at the end of the chapter that says about the ger, Va'ahavta lo kamocha, that you should love the stranger as you love yourself.
Harold, was your hand up? I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh, he read my question about
Okay.
widow and widower being the same, and I think it's just an extension of Israelites versus everybody.
Yes, that's right, for sure.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lockshin. It was a pleasure to learn with you. I want to let everyone know about our next great event, which will be on Monday with Dara Horn. That will be in person if you're in the Phoenix area, and also virtual if you're not. So we hope you can join us for that, which will be at 7 p.m. Pacific time, since we're changing the clocks on Sunday. So we hope you can all join us, and thank you all so much for being here today. Have a great day.